Hi, it's Peter Schiff. It is Monday, October 15th, 2012. Well, a lot of my critics have pointed out that my forecast that quantitative easing would produce inflation was wrong because they look at all the government indexes that purport to measure inflation, such as the CPI, the PCE, the GDP deflator, and they use those numbers to prove that I'm wrong. Well, first of all, I never said that quantitative easing would lead to inflation. Quantitative easing is inflation. Inflation is an expansion of the money supply. Prices rise as a result of that expansion. So when the Fed is printing money, creating money out of thin air, and using it to buy bonds or mortgages, that's inflation. Now, what I have said is that the inflation that the Fed is creating will lead to rising consumer prices. And again, critics such as Paul Krugman will point to government measures to say Peter Schiff is wrong, there is no inflation. Well, first of all, there is a lag between inflating the money supply and rising prices, particularly consumer prices, because the new money enters the economy through different means. Sometimes inflation shows up first in asset prices, like rising stock prices, rising real estate prices, or rising bond prices. All of that can result from inflation. But no matter where it begins, it always ends in consumer prices. The question is, how long does it take? Because remember, nobody wants bonds. When you're buying bonds, you don't want a piece of paper. You want the purchasing power associated with that bond. You want to be able to buy consumer goods with the dividends, or with the interest payments rather, or with the principal when the bond matures. So ultimately, all that inflation is going to find its way into consumer prices. However, I have also maintained that government measures are inaccurate, that they underreport the true effect that inflation is already having on consumer prices here in the United States. Now, again, some of my critics will say, oh, this is all a conspiracy theory. Peter Schiff thinks that the government is cooking the books, that they're manipulating the data. That's not what I say. My position is that the data is flawed by design because the methodology for calculating the increase in consumer prices was deliberately engineered to underestimate just how much consumer prices are in fact rising. So it's not that somebody is fudging the numbers. The numbers were designed to be fudged because of the methodology for calculating them. Now, anecdotally, I've always maintained that, look, just open your eyes and look at what's actually happening with prices. Don't believe what the government is telling you. Well, now there's some more anecdotal evidence to suggest that I'm right, confirming my suspicion that inflation is far worse than the government lets on. Fox News just released the results of a presidential poll last week. Came out on Wednesday. And if you look into that poll, buried deep within it, question number 31, and this is a comprehensive poll. They surveyed over 1,200 registered voters by telephone, landline, cell phone, scientific poll. But question 31, and I'll read that question. It says, which of the following is the biggest economic problem facing people like you? Now, as a result of that question, by more than a 2-to-1, or excuse me, by almost a 2-to-1 margin, the number one problem that Americans identified on this poll is rising prices. Rising prices. Almost twice as many people listed rising prices as their primary concern. 41% as opposed to 24% who mentioned unemployment as their primary concern. Now, among women, it was even worse. 44% of women identified rising prices as their main economic concern, as opposed to 38% of men. That makes a lot of sense. They do most of the grocery shopping. They are more in tune to the price increases. Look at housing. Only 7% of people said housing was their biggest concern, the housing market. 7 times as many people were concerned about rising prices for food and energy as were concerned about falling prices for houses. In fact, even though housing prices might be falling, the cost of maintaining a house is rising because insurance rates are rising, maintenance costs are rising, taxes are rising, home ownership is getting more expensive, even if the price of houses are not. But it's also significant if you look across all the demographic groups, white, non-white, college educated, non-college educated, the results are always the same. The number one concern by a wide margin is inflation. Now, how can this be? After all, the government says there's no inflation. So are people just hallucinating this problem? Are average voters, average consumers worried about prices that aren't even going up? Remember, Ben Bernanke not only thinks that inflation is not a problem, he thinks it's too low. He actually wants to make the inflation rate higher because Ben Bernanke is worried about the opposite of inflation. He's worried about deflation. He thinks that prices might fall, and so he wants inflation to be higher to give him a cushion. He wants a little insurance against deflation, so he's willing to tolerate or create more inflation to guard against that possibility. And of course, Ben Bernanke says that if we just create inflation, we might have more jobs. Well, twice as many people are worried about inflation than unemployment. And Ben Bernanke thinks that we're going to create jobs by creating inflation. Just how does that happen? Well, one way is he thinks, well, if we create inflation, housing prices will go up. And through the wealth effect, people will have more wealth and they'll go out and spend more money. And that will create more jobs. Well, first of all, 7 times as many people are worried about the fact that inflation is already too high, as opposed to worried about real estate market. But the Fed is not going to create purchasing power by creating inflation. He's going to destroy purchasing power, because if he keeps creating inflation and consumer prices keep rising, in fact, they're going to rise even faster in the future than they are now. Consumers aren't going to have any extra money for discretionary purchases. They're going to be spending all of their money on basic necessities like food and energy. Also, it's amazing that despite the media's preoccupation with unemployment and the housing market and basically no coverage at all of inflation, the people in this poll are still identifying inflation as their primary concern, despite the fact that they hear otherwise in the media. And of course, if you watch the presidential debates or the vice presidential debates, inflation wasn't even mentioned. There wasn't a question about inflation. What are you going to do about inflation? Nobody is discussing it. Nobody cares about it except the voters, except the consumers who are actually shopping at the stores and paying these rising prices that all the government bureaucrats are assuring us are not rising. But what's more likely? What's more likely? That the consumers who are buying stuff are just hallucinating, that they're worried about a non-existent problem? Or maybe the government's got it wrong. Maybe the statisticians using their models are wrong. Maybe inflation is really a lot higher than what the government acknowledges. And you know, that makes a lot more sense to me. And once you accept that, a lot more makes sense. For example, the government claims the economy is growing only because the GDP deflator is so small. We got the last GDP number again. Government said the economy is growing at 1.3% because inflation was assumed to be 1.6%. Well, what if it's not? How could it be 1.6%? If it was, it wouldn't be the number one concern on voters' minds. If inflation is north of 3%, which is far more likely, the economy is already contracting. And that makes a lot more sense to me. People keep wondering why the recovery isn't creating jobs or why the recovery isn't creating rising incomes. Well, the reason it's not doing it is because the recovery is an illusion. It's not real. And so since there's no real recovery, how can we get real jobs? How can we get real gains in our incomes? And here's what really should bother you. If the government, if the Federal Reserve thinks inflation is non-existent now, think about how much worse it's going to be, because they are deliberately creating more because they don't think it's enough. So all the people who were polled, who think inflation is bad now, they ain't seen nothing yet. Wait till they see how much worse it's going to get. Remember, we're going to continue to talk about topics like this on my daily radio show, The Peter Schiff Show. So don't forget to tune in Mondays through Fridays, 10 a.m. to noon Eastern Time at schiffradio.com. And if you can't listen live, just go there any time of the day. We keep looping the program for 24 hours. Bye for now.